Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I am Muneeb Hamid with the news of this hour. Let's begin with the headlines first. India has registered 1,172 deaths and more than 95,000 infections overnight, the world's highest single-day surge so far. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, 6 people have lost their lives to the virus overnight, taking the toll to 6,365 with nearly 300,000 cases. The coronavirus has claimed more than 900,000 lives and infected nearly 28 million people across the globe. The Arab League has dropped a draft Palestinian resolution condemning the last month's normalization deal between Israel and the UAE. But it reaffirmed the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, which conditions normalization with Israel on complete withdrawal to the pre-1967 borders. This was confirmed by Arab League Assistant Secretary General Hossam Zaki in a statement after the meeting. Seven people have died in wildfires in Washington, Oregon and California, with recent heat waves and high winds-driven blazes. Officials said fires have damaged hundreds of buildings, forcing thousands of people to flee their homes. They said fires have burned more than 2.5 million acres of land in California, 480,000 acres in Washington and 300,000 in Oregon. Floods have killed at least 13 people and injured 19 others in Burkina Faso following days of heavy rains across the country. Government officials said the floods have caused massive damage and have displaced thousands. Torrential rains over the past week have devastated parts of Niger, Senegal and Cameroon, killing dozens and displacing tens of thousands. News coming in detail after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Now let's have the news in detail. United States Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad has warned spoilers are becoming desperate in their attempts to disrupt the Afghan peace process. In a series of tweets, Khalilzad said Afghans know a successful peace process is the only antidote to the country's protracted conflict. The U.S. envoy bemoaned the attack on Afghanistan's first vice president, Amrullah Saleh. Khalilzad called it the latest example of enemies trying to sabotage the historic opportunity for peace. He also called on the two negotiating teams in Qatar's capital Doha to satisfy Afghans' yearning for peace. Khalilzad and the delegations are in Doha, where the negotiations will be held. Both Kabul and the Taliban have already announced their teams for the talks. Now, India has registered 1,172 deaths and more than 95,000 infections overnight, the world's highest single-day surge so far. The coronavirus has claimed more than 900,000 lives and infected nearly 28 million people across the globe. More details in this report.
The new coronavirus is showing no signs of abating in India. India has become the virus epicenter with more than 75,000 total deaths and over 4.4 million positive cases. The virus is now spreading through the Southeast Asian region, shutting down Indonesia's Jakarta. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says Washington stands with the region to counter this challenge.
The United States has also devoted new resources to help ASEAN countries face the current pandemic, as well as future ones. As Foreign Minister of Singapore encouraged last night, the ASEAN Public Health Emergency Coordination System, through $1.5 million in funding from the State Department, will increase ASEAN's ability to respond as a region to emerging public health crises.
Europe is reconsidering imposing travel restrictions as the disease returns in number to France, Italy, Spain and the UK. In Australia, unrest and frustration is growing over lockdown and nighttime curfew in the state of Victoria, where cases refuse to go down. Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison says he had booked a massive stash of vaccine ahead of the time to give his countrymen hope.
They need some hope today, and particularly in Victoria they need some hope today. And so that is what we're here to deliver today. Today we take another significant step to protect the health of Australians against the coronavirus pandemic. A $1.7 billion agreement for the supply and production of more than 80 million vaccine doses.
Japan is considering lowering the alert level in the capital, Tokyo, because of a considerable reduction in cases. Meanwhile, South Korea continues to grapple with new clusters, adding to the community in the country.
Meanwhile, in Pakistan, the number of active COVID-19 cases has reduced to 5,540. The Health Ministry says nearly 288,000 patients have recovered so far. The ministry said the country's death toll rose by 6 to 6,365. It said 441 people tested positive for the virus in the last 24 hours, taking the count of confirmed cases to over 299,000. Sindh remains the most affected province with over 131,000 infections, while Punjab has reported more than 97,000 cases so far. Moving on now, the Arab League has dropped a draft Palestinian resolution condemning last month's normalization deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. But it reaffirmed the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, which conditions normalization with Israel on complete withdrawal to the pre-1967 borders. Palestine's Foreign Minister Riyad al-Maliki said the deal has undermined the position of Arab states on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister called for the establishment of a Palestinian state along the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud said Riyadh supports all efforts to reach a comprehensive solution to the dispute. Now, 7 people have died in wildfires in Washington, Oregon and California with recent heat waves and high-driven blazes. Officials said fires have damaged hundreds of buildings, forcing thousands of people to flee their homes. They said fires have burned more than 2.5 million acres of land in California, 480,000 acres in Washington and 300,000 in Oregon. California Highway Patrol says the fast-moving Bear Fire has carved a 25-mile path of destruction through the mountainous terrain. Over in Oregon, 3 people were confirmed dead as fires destroyed 5 small towns. Oregon Governor Kate Brown says the disaster can be worst wildfire tragedy in the state's history. Authorities warn the death toll can rise as the wildfires are projected to worsen in the coming days. The US has revoked visas for more than 1,000 Chinese students and researchers over alleged stealing of sensitive research. The State Department spokeswoman says the move was taken as part of the U.S. response to China's curbs on democracy in Hong Kong. Earlier, speaking in Washington, Homeland Security official Chad Wolf said they revoked the visas for students with ties to China's military. He said the charges include unjust business practices and industrial espionage by China. Meanwhile, some Chinese students said they received notices from the U.S. Embassy in Beijing informing them their visas had been cancelled. United States House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says any potential US-UK trade deal will not pass the Congress if London undermines the Good Friday Agreement. In a statement, Pelosi, the UK must respect the Northern Ireland Protocol as signed with the EU to ensure the free flow of goods across the border. She said the US Congress will proudly defend the Good Friday Agreement. Pelosi said the agreement is treasured by the American people. The Good Friday Pact mandates free trade between Northern Ireland and mainland Britain, but the EU says the border should require check-ins in some cases. Moving on, Ukraine says its border remains open for Belarusians, but Kiev will respond strongly against any attempts by Russia to abuse it. Speaking in Lisbon, Foreign Ministry Dmitry Kuleba said strengthening of Russia's position in Belarus is a threat to Ukraine's security. Kuleba said Ukraine wants an independent and sovereign Belarus where democracy can flourish. Belarus has been rocked by mass protests since the re-election of President Alexander Lukashenko in a disputed poll. Now, Serbia has suspended its participation in all military exercises with foreign partners for 6 months. In a statement, Defence Minister Alexander Vulian said the country is facing enormous and undeserved pressure from the EU. Vulian said the bloc has asked Belgrade to leave the planned military exercise with Belarus. The Defence Minister said the country will not take part in any exercises, whether it is with the NATO or Russia. It said Serbia's participation in peacekeeping operations will also be reconsidered. The joint Russian-Serbian Belarusian military exercises are scheduled from today in Belarus. Meanwhile, floods have killed at least 13 people and injured 19 others in Burkina Faso following days of heavy rains across the country. Government officials said the floods have caused massive damage and have displaced thousands. The officials say the Torrential Administration Ministry is working to provide people with a shelter in public buildings. They say the Finance Ministry will allocate $9 million to help flood victims. Torrential rains over the past weeks have devastated parts of Niger, Senegal and Cameroon, killing dozens and displacing tens of thousands. Pakistan says it welcomes close cooperation with Tajikistan at the multilateral level, including the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi discussed bilateral ties with his Tajik counterpart Sirojuddin Mohriddin on the sidelines of the SCO meeting. The two officials agreed to focus on increasing trade, connectivity and people-to-people contact. They also exchanged views on the ongoing efforts to bring peace and stability in Afghanistan. The foreign ministers shared experience to contain COVID-19 pandemic in their respective countries. Meanwhile, Amnesty International says Myanmar's military gets billions of dollars from a secretive Myanmar business conglomerate. Amnesty said its investigations into Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited shows the military has received dividends of as much as $18 billion from the Yangon-based company over the years. The international rights group said the entire board of the company is made up of senior military officials. The Amnesty's business head said perpetrators of some of the worst human rights violations in Rohingya genocide benefit from these business activities. Mark Dumet said Myanmar's government should use the profits of this military company to compensate the families of the genocide victims. More news coming up in this bulletin after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back now. Fires at Greece's largest migrant camp have left nearly 13,000 people without shelter. The blazes completely gutted the overcrowded camp, which was designed for fewer than 3,000 people. Greek officials say many of the migrants will be temporarily placed on ships at a nearby port or in tents flown in from Athens. About 400 teenagers and children have been transferred to the mainland. Greek Migration Minister Notis Mitarachi says about 2,000 people might not have access to a shelter. It said authorities are working to provide emergency accommodation near the Moria campsite. It is unclear how the fires began, with some blaming the migrants and others blaming Greek locals. The average size of wildlife populations has fallen by 2/3 in less than 50 years as forests were felled to grow food. The World Wildlife Fund raises a stark warning and calls for saving nature in order to save humans. Conservation scientists monitored almost 21,000 populations of nearly 4,400 vertebrate species, giving an overview of the state of the natural world. They say land conversion for farming and the wildlife trade were key reasons for the 68% drop in populations between 1970 and 2016. The WWF report says the human activity severely degraded 3/4 of all land and 40% of the Earth's oceans. It warns continued natural habitat loss hikes the risk of future pandemics as humans expanded their contact with wild animals. WWF Director General Marco Lambertini says serious decline in wildlife indicate Nature is unraveling and the Earth is flashing red warning signs of systems failure. A United Nations report says concentrations of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere hit a record high this year. The report showed economic slowdown amid the coronavirus pandemic had little lasting effects. Details in this report.
The greenhouse gases have regained their control in the world, making atmosphere hotter and harmful for the population. A report by the World Meteorological Organization says climate warming is now at its highest level in 3 million years. The report details how climate change is expected to put hundreds of millions of more people at risk of flooding.
At the same time, we have seen the main greenhouse gas concentrations to grow. Especially, we have broken records in concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide. And out of those, carbon dioxide is the most important because it has contributed 2/3 of the warming.
After declining sharply this spring, global emissions of greenhouse gases are now nearly back to pre-pandemic levels. Daily emissions fell in April by 17% relative to the previous year. But by early June, as factories reopened, emissions were back up to within 5% of 2019 levels. The head of World Meteorological Organizations, Patri Talas, says the drop in the emissions this year is not going to change the big picture.
We have seen a drop in the emissions this year because of the COVID crisis and lockdowns in many countries, and we expect that this year the emissions will be 4 to 7% lower than the emissions last year. But this is not going to change the big picture because of the extremely long lifetime of carbon dioxide, and we have continued seeing records in atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide.
The number of people living in water-scarce areas by mid-century is now estimated to reach up to 3.2 billion, up from the previous estimate of about 1.9.
A monk in Myanmar has taken social responsibility to cut the plastic waste in his neighborhood. Around 2,500 tons of trash was being thrown out every day in Yangon. Now it is used to produce utensils, sunshades and even shelters. More about a rather beautiful plastic world in this report.
Abed Otamasara, who runs a meditation center in Yangon, noticed a surge in plastic waste during the pandemic. He launched a recycling drive and was taken aback by the response. Helped by dozens of volunteers, his team now receives several thousand used plastic bottles a day from the community. These plastic containers are now being used as a substitute for bowls at his monastery to feed thousands of people in need.
The plastic waste can be used to build streets and for construction. That's why we save our daily plastic waste into the plastic bottle to donate to him.
The 9-acre meditation center hosts workshops to process plastic waste. Volunteers used hanging plastic bottles to make sunshades. They have even constructed a shelter using car tires packed with plastic waste and cement to form the walls. Otamasara estimates 2 tons of plastic waste, or around 200,000 plastic bottles, have been recycled so far.
These people who help me cut the bottles are meditation practitioners at my center. With their assistance, I have used hundreds of thousands of plastic bottles to make items. It has saved me an estimated $10,000 on buying new bowls.
The monk says he intends to continue using the waste for any necessary structure at his meditation centers, not only to share awareness but also to partially solve the waste problem.
So stocks in Asia Pacific are trading higher. Investors are rallying to overnight jumps on Wall Street, where all major bourses gained over 2%. Mainland Chinese Shanghai Composite is trading up fractionally. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index is also slightly higher. In Japan, the Nikkei 225 and the Topix Index advanced over 0.5%. Meanwhile, South Korea's Kospi gained close to 1%. Shares in Australia also traded in positive territory, with the ASX 200 up marginally. And now let's have a look at the weather updates across the globe. Well, that's all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Take care.